This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students and everyone in between, cultural workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Christina Carney, who teaches in the Department of Black Studies at University of Missouri. Along with a number of scholarly essays in key journals, she is author of Disreputable Women, Black Sex Economies and the Making of San Diego, published by University of California Press in 2025. In this conversation, we discuss the transformative role of gender and class in Black studies discourse, the importance of Black California for thinking about African American life, and the imperatives for Black studies to take sexual economies seriously when theorizing the structure of Black life. Good afternoon, Christina. How are you?
Afternoon. I'm doing great. Thank you.
Well, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. I'm really excited that we have this chance to talk. I think so much of your research is really essential for how we think about Black studies, carceral studies, sexuality studies. It's really just your research has a richness to it that I think will be an essential contribution to this podcast. And so I appreciate your time and thoughtfulness, and just really it's a fantastic to have a chance to get your voice as part of the series.
Thank you.
Let me start. You'll have a chance to talk about your research and how you imagine the field of Black studies and all of that, but I wanted to start with a more personal question and just ask you, what is it that drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And for me, always that companion question of what sustained you in relation to this kind of work?
It's a wonderful question. So I think the study of Black life, particularly contestations over space and place, really have intrigued me since I was a young child, growing up in Bronzeville, a neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. So I lived 2 blocks west of Cottage Grove, which was the dividing line between the High Park neighborhood and the University of Chicago campus, and then my own neighborhood. And because of this geographical designation, I always knew my place. But I also had privilege because I was raised middle class. And I was also raised in the home or the house that my grandfather was born in on 48th and Langley. So I had a lot of pride in my family's histories, who, originally migrated from Mississippi and Louisiana. And I was also a very curious child. I really had no choice since I was the only child in a family of mostly adults at the time. So listening to the adults in my life talk about property value and race, or how a white woman walking their dog was a sign of the neighborhood changing. But as I grew up, I realized that it was more complicated than it was. So I heard this story when my parents first moved into the house on Langley. They said some working class Black folks in the neighborhood came up to them. And mind you, both of my parents were both young professionals. And they said to them, "Don't push us out." And that was a profound moment, just thinking about class divisions in the Black community,
Mm-hmm.
And another profound moment was in high school. I decided to attend school on the near north side in Lincoln Park. We called it LP, which was also the neighborhood for high school students who lived in Cabrini Green, infamous public housing project on the near north side. And in my 4 years at LP, I had never seen such stark inequality, inequity, racism, classism, all the things. And it seemed that it was deeper than what was going on the other side of town in my neighborhood of Bronzeville. And this deep inequality was also embedded into the high school. So you had the children of mostly white and wealthy parents who were enrolled in the IB International Baccalaureate program, which was a win for them because they dodged thousands of dollars in private high school tuition. And then you had students who traveled all over the city like me to participate in a program they called double honors. And then you had the normal classes, which were populated mostly by students from the local housing project. And so CPS, Chicago Public Schools, were letting us know where we would later be placed in life. We had these 3 tiers. So you had the first tier, already wealthy, new upper middle class folks. Second tier, middle class, lower middle class. And then for others, it was like this continued cycle of state neglect and poverty. And of course, there's complexity in that, but basically, that was the expected trajectory. But we also had teachers who cared at Lincoln Park, even if it was only one. And so I took a AP human geography course. It was either in my third or fourth year of high school. It was taught by teacher or Mr. Eric Young. I still have a photo of him on my desk at home right now. And he was a Black man from Philadelphia, and he was my first master teacher. I remember him taking us on a field trip to the last remaining Black-owned business in a nearby area, and it was a Black barbershop in an area that was becoming heavily gentrified. And the pending demolishment of Cabrini Green housing projects was really the catalyst for this urban development. But I remember Mr. Young, my AP human geography teacher, critiqued and really challenged these efforts, and he brought his students into the conversation. So like these experiences before college really fundamentally shaped my trajectory and my current political commitments and scholarly focus. And so from there, I attended the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign after participating in a bridge program for inner city students. For the first 2 years, I was a political science major, and then I took a course that changed my life and made me really consider graduate school. And the course was called Race, Sex, and Deviance, and it was a mixed-level course with advanced undergraduates and graduate students taught by Lisa Marie Cacho, who is now professor at the University of Virginia in American Studies. So really after taking that course, I decided to double major in African American Studies and also Women's Studies. And so there were programs at the time, so my degree was officially in interdisciplinary studies. But it was in these courses that I now had like the language to articulate what I have been seeing and also experiencing in my very like young life. I also took courses with Dr. Ruth Nicole Brown. She's now chair of African American Studies at Michigan State University. Her critical insights into Black girlhood totally changed the way I talked about Black girls and women, including myself. But Dr. Cacho was the one who encouraged me to apply for the McNair's program, which is a program that prepares marginalized students for the rigors of graduate school. So for my capstone and my McNair final project, I wrote like over 100-page paper about how the racialized and gendered language used to describe African American women on welfare in the 80s and 70s was now being used against Mexican immigrant women. And I use U.S. congressional hearings as a primary source to really justify my claims. And then after college at UIUC, I attended the University of California, San Diego, and I was a doctoral student in the ethnic studies program. So though not an official Black studies department at the time, we had a lot of influential Black scholars and thinkers. So I was very lucky to work with Fatima El-Tayeb, Dale Gore, Sarah Clark Kaplan, Denise Feja da Silva, just to name a few. And again, just like in Bronzeville and Lincoln Park back in Chicago, I was really fascinated by the spatial politics and urban development in San Diego. So originally I wanted to do a project on race in Brazil, but when Denise left UCSD, I decided to lean into what I was already doing in the community. So at the time, me and my partner were promoting and organizing parties, nightlife events, and more like quote unquote family inclusive events for Black queer women and women of color in Hillcrest, which was the city's gay territory. So that experience, full of a lot of anti-Black racism by white and Latinx queer straight people, made me become more interested in local politics and the histories that explain the dynamics of Black migration to San Diego. And there were some articles about it, but there was no real canon. So I decided that I would take on this project. And so I'm really humbled by the fact that Disreputable Woman, my book that just came out in July, through the new Sexual World series by Marlon Bailey and Jeffrey McCoon through UC Press, is the first monograph on not just Black people, but Black women in San Diego, a place that's imagined as being void of Black people. And
Mhm.
currently, I'm working on a book about Chicago using my family's genealogy. So I guess things have come back full circle for me.
That's amazing. It's I'm also struck by just the when I listen to and talk with people about their paths into study of Black life and Black studies, just the chances, just the chance occurrences that put people on a different path. That you happen to take this mixed level class on sex, race, deviance, and change your life, and that Ruth Nicole Brown, by the way, one of our early podcasts, you know, wandering into that class, and just those are chance occasions that are just like absolutely transformative in the sense of like giving shape, from the way you were telling it, sort of giving shape to all these questions and experiences that you were sort of collecting together. And I do always love when area studies, whether it's gender studies or ethnic studies or Black studies, wins out over a discipline like political science. It feels like a little bit of a
Absolutely.
victory, since they always have the bigger grants and all of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I had actually planned to read your book this summer, but personal stuff got in the way. But I can't wait to read it. I did not understand that it is the first book about Black people in San Diego. That's actually huge.
Mhm.
Um, and as someone who has like multi-generational family roots in Southern California, that's actually pretty remarkable. I just think Black California has so little treatment, but I hadn't realized that San Diego had none. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, thank you for that work in that way. I mean, if somebody has to break the first ground, and hopefully it's the beginning of a lot of others. So,
And that's how I think about it, because when the book was done, I was like, "Oh, I wanted to put this in there. Oh, I wanted to put that in there," but I had to realize, okay, this is the first, and it's other scholars' job to use this as a catalyst to think about other questions and converge and also diverge from our work. So, that's also humbling too.
so let me ask you about the field of Black studies. And how you imagine the field, what's the portrait of the field that you work with. And I always like to ask this in the context of its origins, which was, a tense demand, a pair of demands, right, in tension with each other, between student protesters demanding that there be a place to study Black life, and that Black studies was going to be that place, that disciplines had failed to provide an account of Black history, Black art, Black expressive culture, etc. Black studies became that, right? So there's a demand for this intellectual life, this intellectual space and world of ideas. But of course, all of that's happening in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when Black liberation struggle had radicalized to the point of really contesting the boundaries between something like a classroom and a community, between study of an intellectual life and political prescription, between study, writing, and action. And so that other part of Black studies is really the demand for a certain kind of politics and a certain kind of prescriptive orientation towards liberation struggle. And I think that it's a tension. I'd never want to call it a contradiction, but I think it's still with us today. But sort of, what is Black studies? Is it primarily about political prescriptions around liberation struggle, or is it primarily about the pursuit of ideas and histories and culture questions? So all of that is a way of sort of staging the question to you. So what is that portrait of Black studies that you work with? What's your imagination of the field?
Hmm. I think this question is so important, especially at this time and moment. And I think negotiation is key and critical to this conversation. That's why Black feminism, I think, as a theoretical concept, I think is so critical to the field of Black studies and African American studies. So I'm in Black studies, but I'm also jointly appointed with women's and gender studies. And my position as professor of Black queer sexuality studies was actually created out of the demands by student activists during the 2015 uprisings that occurred here on campus that was directly connected to the racial turmoil and protests in Ferguson, Missouri, which is only a couple of hours away from the Mizzou campus. So my commitment to this lineage is, also deeply personal to me. So this semester, I'm teaching a Black feminist course, very similar to the Race, Sex, and Deviance course I took as an undergraduate because it's mixed level. And, these histories in terms of Black feminist histories really animate our very lively discussions about the usefulness of women or woman feminism as concepts and ideas, because it was really Black women activists and theorists who challenged the instability of these categories of difference, since, woman and even feminism has really been a function of whiteness. So I think Black feminists in the U.S., starting in the late 19th century, have always kept, quote unquote, their ear to the street, their ear to the ground, but also positioned Black women as central to our understanding of what freedom truly looks like. And of course, that needs to be complicated along the lines of class, sexuality, region, etc. But that was the framing by people like Mary Church Terrell, Frances W. Harper, even Ida B. Wells, even though Wells focused exclusively on the lynching of Black men and not Black women. But still, I position these thinkers as really foundational to what we now understand as feminism or even Black studies, and not the Elizabeth Stantons or the Susan B. Anthonys, even though they're important in their own right. And now with the derailing of funding and the fact that Black studies programs are now more than ever in their very short institutional life in jeopardy of being dismantled, we, as in Black feminism, is maybe again about to witness the erasure of this scholarship, not only in academia, but possibly the popular imaginary. So I've really tried to think about small scale ways to resist this. And the only space I have some autonomy over, knock on wood, and that's my classroom.
Mhm.
And so I really truly believe in the mission of public scholarship or public facing scholarship to get all the information that we're learning in these classrooms and making available to a lay audience, or making it something more accessible. So that's my praxis. So for past semesters and classes that I've taught intersectionality or Black sexual politics, I partner with Wiki Education. And I kind of use that as a way to improve, of course, digital and media literacy skills, but also really strengthen undergraduate research skills by having students create or expand on topics that are underrepresented in Wikipedia. And that's definitely Black studies. And, Wikipedia is important. When I was in graduate school, people shamed you for looking on Wikipedia. Now that's the first place that people go. It's the fifth most visited site in the world. And it's really a major source of information globally. And so to have both, accurate information around racialized gender and sexuality, I think is so important. And they're learning to not only diversify the internet, but also to learn how to write code,
Mm.
So for Black sexual politics, I had them, pick something that was relevant to the class, but we use Stacey Patton's article in the Chronicle of Higher Education, Who's Afraid of Black Sexuality, as a springboard. And so over the span of 5 semesters, students edited 76 articles. Some people created new pages, like, for example, Rogers versus American Airlines in 1981 that talks about the Crown Act in California, LGBT representations in hip hop. Those were all new pages.
Hmm.
And, these 5 classes, they actually added a total of over like 51,000 words to Wikipedia. And many of the information on Wikipedia came from peer-reviewed sources, from feminist studies, ethnic studies, women's studies, like journals, right? And so again, I was really trying to bridge what students were learning in the classroom to a more accessible space. But this semester, I'm taking another approach. So in my Black feminist course, students, must find 2 to 3 peer-reviewed articles written by academics in their home disciplines who cite Black women in their research. So they're not only reading Black feminist theory every week, but they're taking the initiative themselves to use Google Scholar or Elicit, which is a really useful AI platform, to find scholars in political science, psychological sciences, theater, history, sociology. And these are all majors of my students: human development and family science, journalism, visual study, communication and information science, and business, who quote Black feminist theory. So you no longer have an excuse to say, well, I didn't know about Black feminists in my field. In this class, you will. And I was really motivated to do this by rereading Audre Lorde's The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, when she angrily told a conference full of white women that they had no excuse to not know any Black feminists for a feminist conference. And in the essay, she talks about how she was called to present at the last hour and how there was only one panel on Black feminism / women of color feminism. And it was appealing then, and it's even more not appealing, appalling then, and it's even more appalling now because the dynamics, haven't changed. So it's just like with my previous classes I've taught, there's a public-facing component for the Black feminist class. So students have the option to do a paper that they'll eventually read for our department grad symposium or the undergraduate research symposium, or they'll produce a podcast or write an op-ed. But regardless, of their choice, is public facing. So to just circle back to your question, I think the political impact and the development of an intellectual expressive tradition is something that my classes aim to do in one way or another.
I love that. Thank you for that response. There's so much that's interesting in there, and I know a number of people who do Wikipedia-based projects with their students, and I haven't done it, and there's actually no excuse for it, because I actually think it does a couple of things. I'm just really kind of repeating a lot of what you said, but I do think the public, whatever that means, like non-students, non-professors, non-teachers, do want to learn. And sort of where are they learning? And there's lots of places they're learning, and Wikipedia is a major place to learn. But also the way learning is, the idea that learning is not political I don't think it's ever been a viable position, but I don't think in 2025, with all the banning of this or that, even like tag in a grant proposal, right? The idea is that the very mention of words is an act of insurrection. So, which is, hyperbolic and hateful from the fascist government, but it also is underscoring, all of these things about, when people learn and have new words for their world, or more precise words for their worlds are changed, and it becomes political at the same time. And the way that the way you described what you're doing in the classroom, I think just brings that stuff together, not just as a comment that you or I are making in public or on this podcast or in a paper, but actually putting it out there. And I imagine those students are like, hey, go look at what we did, to their friends and family, and the way that spreads. And
absolutely,
that's, as you said, that's real Black studies work, and the best way. I love that. And so let me ask about your work. You've talked a little bit about it. It's informed by gender and sexuality studies, ethnic studies, carceral studies, and And I'm interested in how, when you look at your own research and research orientation, the critical frames that you use, how you see it in relation to the history of the field of Black studies, like sort of where do you think it fits, but also what new horizons or boundaries do you think it opens up and pushes for the field?
Oh, yes. Yeah, so my recent book on sex economies in San Diego does a lot of work, but also much work that needs to be done for Black studies. So I think the most important intervention of my work to Black studies is thinking about Black criminalization and also incarceration through the lens of sex work. And looking at sex work history, I think, gives us a more nuanced approach to understanding how crime is constructed and constituted. And also, in this case, the buildup of California's prison industrial complex using the bodies of Black women. And so I talk about how the criminalization of street-involved sex workers was central to really how the state enforced racial segregation and also managed the racial anxieties of a national body politic in the 20th century. And it really illustrated how sex worker history is key to statecraft. And so I'm sorry I didn't name my book. So my book is called Disreputable Women, Black Sex Economies in the Making of San Diego. And it really talks about how, Black women make place and community in a city that sought to criminalize, incarcerate, and also dehouse them in order to make the city appear white. And when people think about San Diego, they think of it as a white military town, even though the U.S.-Mexico border is only a few miles away. But this is a construction that has suited the needs of city boosters and also the military. And so in the book, I demonstrate how homosexual, non-heterosexuality, heterosexual, trans, and gender nonconforming outlaws, to borrow from Kathy Cohen, really defied heteropatriarchal norms of white domesticity by using private space and public institutions for sex work. But I also talk about how it hinges, thinking about going back to Black studies, I also think it hinges on a key contradiction, right? So like the city's status as a military center, created the demand for the very sex workers whose presence would be so violently policed. And so the project really tries to balance attention to like state and structural violence with attention to how these Black women's creative interventions in an economy organized around their exploitation. So it's a really dialectical approach, and each chapter is really structured around the push and pull of social struggle. So, San Diego Citycraft needed Black labor for infrastructure and then hoped to discard it, for example. But the book shows Black women are refusing this disposal. And also in doing so, they kind of repurpose spaces towards their own use, take up mutual aid projects designed to fill gaps in state neglect that the state actually created, and also like resist this politics of erasure. So in the end, the book's most important contributions is this focus on how vice policing makes the modern city, and also more importantly, how Black sex workers and queer women's history is really central rather than incidental to urban history. And this is not the book or research I imagined myself doing when I first started. It was really the archive, and I even say the ancestors guided me, I think. At first, I saw what was my dissertation at the time as being more cultural studies and contemporary, but I needed to begin with the history. But that history was nowhere to be found, right? So essentially, I had to create a methodology and also framework of doing Black studies in a U.S.-Mexico border town in Southern California, in a place where Blackness isn't as imagine as existing, even for the Black people who are like here. So, I think in terms of Black studies, another contribution is looking at the geographical focus, right? So for the Great Migration was framed as like this masculinist narrative, North and South, But luckily, we have folks like Marianne Thaggart, her book, Writing Jane Crow, which just discusses Black women in the real world, or Marcia Chatlin's Southside Girls, which talks about class and mobility politics in Chicago during the early 20th century. And then eventually there was a robust community of folks who started to write about Black California, but it's still only a handful of people talking about smaller locales in the Southwest like San Diego. Um, and so when I think about Black studies, Black feminism, space and place, uh, I'm really indebted to the work of like Catherine McKittrick and other Black feminist geographers, right? I talk about rooming boarding houses that were eventually converted to single room occupancies. A lot of scholars talk about public housing projects, but not so much about these other alternative living arrangement, which were really the only places for Black people to live and even work once they migrated from the South. And then when developers started tearing down public housing in the latter 20th century and early 21st century, it was actually residential hotels that became sites of refuge for poor folk, right? Another thing that I think needs to be discussed in Black studies literature is talking about Black Masons, Masonic temples and lodges. They're really understudied in Black studies. So, like, the Black church is considered foundational to Black politics and community, but also Prince Hall was too. So, like, before the Black church became the powerful political institution that we now know today, it was Black Masons who provided Black people a space to vote unmolested from white crowds pre-Jim Crow. You know, in the book, I talk about how my main interlocutor, Granville Bubba Hughes, a Black trans woman, she migrated from Phoenix to San Diego in 1965. She talks about the Elks Lodge and the Prince Hall were like the main places where she was allowed to both perform as a drag queen for Black troops, and then eventually later in life when she was a parishioner of a storefront church called the Missionary Baptist Church that's actually housed inside the Masonic Hall every Sunday, right? So for like a Black queen like Bubba, Black Masonic halls were really instrumental to her youth as a sex working drag queen and also as like a Black elder when she decided to like, you know, tone down a little bit. And then another institution that was central to Black life in San Diego was a place called Silver Sands Cafe, owned by Robert Clay, which was eventually the last Black-owned bar diner during the mid-20th century in downtown San Diego. And it makes me think about the place that I went to, the field trip in high school with my AP Human Geography teacher, right? And it was not just a Black gay spot. It was a place where Bubba said all the ghetto Black people would hang. So you had the Black sailors who lived in nearby single room occupancies because they weren't allowed to stay on base in San Diego because of racial segregation, the drag queens, various kinds of sex workers and entrepreneurs. And so like Bubba told me, everybody hung downtown. So I talk about how racial segregation is what consequently made Silver Sands a queer place because people, in a sense, were forced to be around each other and not just tolerate each other, but produce a different type of ethics about community formation, right? So I'm thinking about Black as queer, right? But I also think it's important to understand San Diego as a very racially diverse city with a huge transnational component, right? So, for example, the migration of Black sex workers in San Diego became a reality only because of anti-immigration law that sought to curb the number of Asian women migrants into the U.S. Or maybe how colored rooming houses operated by Black women also house Chinese, Filipino, Mexican folks, and even some poor white folks. But like the interraciality of San Diego downtown sex economy was like a moral panic that spurred calls by first wave feminists, Black ministers and club women, and especially public health officials to demolish the only remaining housing available to poor laborers in downtown. And also thinking more transnational, thinking about the attack on Black sex workers in the early 20th century, this was going on at the same time um, that uh, things were going on in terms of Panama. So towards the end of World War I, the U.S. military also began to systematically quarantine Black and Caribbean women in Panama. And you have Joan Flores, who examines in her book Black women's reproductive labor during the Panama Canal, and, talks about the presence of seemingly unattached women in the region really troubled military officials, right? So what was going on militarily in San Diego was also something that was going on in Panama at the same time. So we just can't talk about San Diego in terms of like this white-Black binary. And that's why I think my doctoral degree in ethnic studies at UC San Diego, which was then led by Yena Spiritu, I think also allowed me to take a more different approach with regard to the study of Black life.
Just a totally personal side note, Joan Flores was a Black Studies major in my former department at Amherst College. So it's like, I hope you listen, Joan. Hello, Amherst College faculty. We're proud of you. You're out there more successful than the rest of us. No, thank you for that. That's it was really interesting to hear you talk about that because of the untreated or unthematized, untheorized, however you want to characterize it, lives, but also embedded in all of these sort of pillars of Black studies, geography, ethnography, urban studies.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really like that you were able to demonstrate so clearly these sort of boundary pushing moments that are also deeply embedded, right? So they end up, the boundary push is a sort of hidden voice in the things that are already, the places that are already being interrogated, right? Or the methods used for that. And, as you put together that book or any of your research projects, and I would say also your classrooms, I'm curious to hear how your training and current department has impacted that, because as you said, your PhD is in ethnic studies, so you didn't come to Black studies through a discipline. You didn't do history or you didn't do sociology and then get into Black studies. Mm-hmm. And now you're in Black studies, which is, again, not a disciplinary department. So I'm interested in how you think your own research is shaped by that intellectual journey from graduate school and even undergrad, as you described it, interdisciplinary studies as your major, and now your workplace. How you think your research and classroom orientation is shaped by non-disciplinary work and a commitment to trans or anti, or however you want to call it, disciplinary ways of working with ideas?
I think I've been quite lucky to have fallen into this trap of not having a discipline. And just having this degree of interdisciplinary studies. So like you said, that was my undergraduate degree. And even the students here at Mizzou who are majoring in Black Studies and WGST, their transcripts will also read as interdisciplinary studies too. So that's interesting. It's kind of like a 17-year difference, but it's still kind of the same thing in terms of this, at least where I'm from, these Midwest institutions and not giving Black Studies, Women and Gender Studies departments. So when I think about the disciplines, I think about projects that are directly related to the method of the discipline. And so like you must craft your research according to like methodological constructs, and you're in a discipline, so let me know if I'm wrong. But when I think about folks in interdisciplinary fields, I think how we're more propelled by the research question and then working backwards. So basically, we ask ourselves, what methods do I need to answer this question instead of like the other way around? Because I think history or literature as a discipline usually have fundamental questions they must attend to. And with us, it may be a little bit different, but maybe not for everyone. And I think it's important to talk about how also my interdisciplinary framing has always been connected to a Black feminist framework or sometimes methodology that attends to the research question. So that was true when I was combing through congressional reports as a McNair scholar and now as an author of a book. And so, like, my methodological framing puts me in a position to create my own methodology, creates my own to create my own framework. So, for the book, for example, I use the disreputable as a Black feminist framework to kind of attend to like the historical, political, economic shifts of Black women's sex work and reproductive labor in 20th century San Diego. So, though thinking about the word disreputable, while early 20th century local reformers and authorities described newly Black sex workers, primarily in the Fifth Ward of downtown, as disreputable, I instead kind of use this term to illustrate how the Black female or the disreputable Black female subject was made, preserved, but also like contested. And so, like, through this inquiry, I unveil how certain Black women's practices toward sexual individual freedom produce a new model of liberative subjecthood, you know? Disreputability is a place-based act of refusal, right? As I talk about the rooming houses and the Masonic temples, but it's also a form of like activism and practice of freedom, which builds on already existing Black feminist scholarship, which is like a really rich genealogy that maps this continuum across time and space. So while reformers, again, characterize these women as disreputable, is something that I kind of appropriated for the book to think about women who do things a little bit differently that kind of create these like anxieties, right? So just thinking about the book, chapter 1. So each chapter of the book can be taught individually. So chapter 1, thinking about the late 19th, early 20th century, of course, I'm relying on criminal archives, right? To think about what Black women were criminalized for, how prostitution, the criminalization of prostitution was very racialized because it wasn't a felony until the military actually made it a felony. And that had a lot to do with politics that were going on in California and in San Diego, right? Chapter 2, I use Maya Angelou's second biographical volume, beginning it, of course, Gathered Together in My Name. And I use it as a sex archive because she talks about being a pimp for 2 lesbians in San Diego and also being a brothel worker in the San Joaquin Valley, right? So how many memoirs do we have? How many memoirs do like white, European, Western women have? And how many do Black women have from the early 20th, mid 20th century? So I think it's really important to take that up as an archive, but also try to read against the grain and bring a lot of those tools from Black studies, women and gender studies, ethnic studies, in terms of trying to create a narrative or arch. And then like the last 2 chapters, which is ethnographic and autoethnographic, right? So the first chapter, criminal archives, second chapter, literary, and then the third and fourth, which is more contemporary, it's like, okay, I actually want to talk to some of these people, right? So thinking about Bubba and thinking about Black life. So during that time in California, my partner had a dispensary business and Bubba just happened to be a customer. And that's how I just met Bubba, for example, right? And Bubba taught me a lot about Black queer San Diego. And it's just like these everyday relationships with people. Or thinking about chapter 4, where I'm talking about how my own placemaking practices, you know, is connected back to these disreputable women from the late 19th to earlier century, right? So it's making these connections across space. And I wouldn't be able to do that if I was just in history. I wouldn't be able to do that if I was just in anthropology. I definitely wouldn't be able to do that in sociology. Being in Black studies, being in an interdisciplinary department allows me to be a lot more flexible in terms of the methodology that I use or create, and also where I borrow from.
I love that. Thank you. That's in the being led by the question and what gathers to help us resolve or intervene in that question. I think that's such a precise and rich way of putting what Black studies does and what multidisciplinary approaches generally do. So, and the way you were able to draw that out across the book. And now I always loves the scholarly moments of complete chance, like the dispensary customer becomes this introduction to an entire life world and its history, and a research project that can, you know, do justice to it, that can give it a voice, that can make sure that, you know, Black studies, Black history knows it. So
Mhm.
I love that. There's something really important theoretically, historically, but also sentimentally, you know,
Mm.
in terms of like it's important that these places you know, end up in an archive of archives, or reporting of archives, which I guess is one way of thinking about what our books are. Um, but the fact that it happens by chance is always so interesting to me. It's true in so many cases.
And you know what else happened, John? I was in Phoenix, Arizona recently for a book talk at a Black indie bookstore called Grassroots Books. And somebody from the audience knew about Granville Bubba Hughes, my interlocutor, and how there
Really?
were stories because Bubba told me, and you know, when you do an ethnography, you never know if stories are true. That's not the point of it anyway. But she talked about how she was the mother of Phoenix because she was the first Black gay person to go out with her heels and her hair done. And they corroborated that story. And so now I'm gonna be traveling back to Phoenix to talk to the historian who did some work on Granville Bubba Hughes, right? And so, like, it was just amazing, and I had to include that and when you said sentimental, because I just had this aha moment. I'm like, "Oh, somebody knows my interlocutor." You know, Bubba unfortunately passed away during a pandemic, but what can we do to, like, honor Bubba after her death? And so we're working on that right now in Phoenix.
I love that. This is beautiful. The beautiful part of stuff that we do. I love that. Thank you. So I have two last questions for you. The first one, sort of a big speculative question about the past 5+ decades of Black studies. What do you think Black studies has done well, and what do you think it's not done particularly well?
Hmm. You know, it still surprises me, you know, being in a subfield of Black studies and even Black feminism in terms of Black sexuality studies, how small we still are. And even when you think about like the big Black studies Africana, African American Studies conferences, we're still like a very small subset, right? And I feel like we're still on the margins. If we go to like ASA or NWSA, it doesn't feel that way, but for like the larger Black studies, African American studies, that's how I kind of feel. So we're still kind of secluded a little bit and maybe not taken seriously in terms of the discipline. But at the same time, you know, we are still teaching these classes, Black feminism, intersectionality, Black sexual politics. So students give us the hope. They're still interested in what we have to say, the deep connections that we're making, how to think about what's going on presently and create an analysis about it. And so I'm reminded, you know, when I first got here to Mizzou, I had just graduated. Actually, I got the job before I actually graduated. So I didn't have a postdoc. I went straight into tenure track. And like I said, my position was created by the students, but I was the only person, I'm still the only person that does Black sexuality studies at the Mizzou campus or who does
Mm.
issues related to that. But, you know, like all Black queers do, we create things, we create our own communities. So I remember they gave me a ton of service work to do, which I took it on. You know, it was after the protest. But one of the things I did during my second year was that they made me director for the annual Black Studies conference. And so, like, I just went into it. So it was called This Is Not Your Grandfather's Black Studies. And I reached out individually to so many people in Black sexuality studies, Black queer, everything, people doing Black trans studies. And I brought them all here to Mizzou. And, you know, I think spaces like that need to be created, right? So we can continue to create safer spaces for ourselves to talk about this work, to create networks, just to create friendships. And so I've been seeing a lot of that. We still do that, you know? And it was great. Because of that, I did a forum. I think it's that they call it forum in American Quarterly based on the conference.
Hmm.
I actually met. That's where I met Jeffrey McCune and also Marlon Bailey. And since then, up until now, we've met almost every month and exchanged work, right? And that happened because I created a space for us at Mizzou, and then I kept in contact, and we decided just to continue to meet up, share our work. And, now I published through their book series, right? So there are ways. And so, again, I don't like the fact that Black queer sexuality studies, again, is not being taken seriously by some powers that be, but we're still creating community scholarship regardless.
I love that. By the way, Jeffrey McCune is earlier podcast in the series, so it's a nice get Marlon Bailey on. So finish that trio there. I like that. I love that. I mean, the creating. If it's not there, create and be generous to each other is I don't know. For me, that's like the ideal of the Black Studies way. So it's fantastic when it's put into practice.
Yeah.
So a last question for you. Thinking about the field of Black Studies, institutional context as a cultural, historical phenomenon, et cetera, what is the question you would want us to all ask, or the issue you would want us to all be thinking about?
The question. Okay. So the question, and this kind of taps into the third book I'm thinking about, is what are we to do in this day and age right now in terms of thinking about Black internationalism and global Blackness? And I'm thinking about that because I just got back from a 9-month research trip to Brazil, courtesy of the Fulbright program. And I was in Salvador, Bahia, Brazil. And it's just really interesting what's going on now with our current administration in office, and also what happened with Bolsonaro. And it's a lot of commonalities and similarities between thinking about what's going on in the U.S. and also what happened in Brazil. And, just being at another institution where I knew the language, where I can talk to professors, I could talk to students, it just makes you just learn so much by getting outside of a U.S. or American academic setting. People are asking different questions. People are challenging your ways that you think about race, for example, especially in a place like Brazil. And so I feel like these conversations need to happen, right? Like, what's the population of Black folk in the United States? And also thinking about class politics too, right? So we need to expand. We need to get outside the U.S. We need to talk to other people. I really believe in that in this moment. And I think some of the things that keep us separated are the conditions that they've created, like language, the ability to move in terms of mobility. And we know about these stories from the 20th century with James Baldwin and folks getting their passports taken away. We know the power of being in community with people in the diaspora. So I feel like with this new technology, AI, whatever, we need to connect more with our comrades and other spaces in the African diaspora. I think it's essential.
Fantastic place to wrap up. I love that. That's a great sentiment, and it's also for lack of a better way of putting it, like an action item. Learn a language, travel, make connections. I mean,
yes.
And I talk about this all the time, so I'm sorry, but it's come up in a number of podcasts for people talking about transnational things, and I'm always like, you have to learn a language, but learning a language is actually great.
Right. And everybody else in the world knows 1 to 2, 3 languages.
And if nothing else, I always say, part of being a writer is, you write and you're never satisfied with it and you're never sure how good it is. But you learn a language and you get an 82 on your test. You just know exactly how good you are. Sometimes it's nice to just have like an
Yes,
objective assessment. How well are you doing? 82%
absolutely.
well. Um, but yeah, I was really looking forward to this, Christina, and this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you for being so generous and with your thoughts about your work, about queer and sexuality studies and Black feminism, and its challenge to the Black studies tradition and its revision of the Black studies tradition. It's such a fantastic conversation and really just an excellent contribution to the series. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you, John.
All right. Well, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.